I'm joined now by White House Press Secretary Stephanie Grisham. And Stephanie, we begin today with just the very latest on where the president is with Iran.
Thank you for having me. The president has been pretty clear. He stands with the very brave Iranian people who are protesting their leadership, and that's a good thing. I think that the president has been very decisive this entire time. It was because of him that he ordered a targeted strike that took out a terrorist who had an intention to kill a lot of Americans, and now he is, again, saying that the Iranian people they should be allowed to do what they want to do and not be hurt by it.
Stephanie, just the critical point that I was talking about previous to bringing you on moments ago, and that is the president had said that one of the reasons why it was so urgent and imminent that Iran's top general, Soleimani, be taken out was because our U.S. embassies, and he listed 4 of them, were under imminent danger. And now we're seeing suggestions, even with Secretary Esper, that perhaps that was not the case. What's the response from the White House?
Well, the president tweeted about this about an hour ago and made clear that all of his national security team are on the same page. I think that, honestly, we're arguing semantics here. The fact of the matter is, again, the president took decisive action and ordered a targeted strike that took out one of the most horrible terrorists in the world and who was planning to kill a lot of Americans. Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Esper, Ambassador O'Brien, and the president have all said there was an imminent threat. Ambassador O'Brien did say that the president was correct, that it looked like there was intelligence to suggest that embassies, 4 of them in 4 different countries, were in danger, among other targets. But again, I think we're arguing semantics. There is a terrorist who's dead, and the Iranian the people are now rising up against their leadership. That's fantastic.
I'm going to push now to impeachment. President Trump suggesting senators should dismiss the House's charges that are coming eventually from Speaker Pelosi. By tweeting this, many believe that by the Senate giving credence to a trial based on the no evidence, no crime, read the transcripts, no pressure impeachment hoax, rather than an outright dismissal, it gives the partisan Democrat witch hunt credibility that it otherwise does not have. I agree. What's the president communicating there?
Well, I think the president is communicating that there should be a dismissal because he did nothing wrong. Nancy Pelosi herself said this weekend that one way or another, this president will not be president next week. So talk about obstruction of Congress and talk about trying to interfere in an election. The president shouldn't have to go through this. He did nothing wrong. He released transcripts willingly because he did nothing wrong. And so he's made that clear all along. Obviously, he would want a dismissal of everything. But at the end of the day, if it does go to the Senate for a trial, he does want it to be fair, which is all he deserves.
And Stephanie, real quickly,
sure.
Why threaten to put executive privilege on somebody like a John Bolton? What is the president's concern?
I think he has concerns for future presidents. Any president is going to need to be able to talk to all of his senior advisors, and certainly anybody who has to deal with national security, and feel that they can talk very frankly and openly about intelligence matters and matters that the rest of the world doesn't need to know about. So I think the president is actually looking out for future presidencies.
Yeah, you can see that criticism is coming that he had previously wanted a Senate trial that would have witnesses. This is one witness that the Democrats would push for. Now they don't have to because John Bolton, former national security advisor, says if you subpoena him, he'll come forth. We'll cover the news on that as it happens. 13 former White House press secretaries, no doubt. You're following this story. Foreign service and military officials got together calling on the White House to hold those regular press briefings. Writing this in an op-ed, regular briefings force a certain discipline on government decision-making. Knowing there are briefings scheduled is a powerful incentive for administration officials to complete a policy process on time in times of military conflict and international crisis. These briefings take on even more importance, end quote. Your response?
I think the notion that policy would be done based on the fact that press briefings are held is quite silly. I also think that in this day and age, with a president who has so unorthodox in politics and has really rewritten the rules of politics, he talks to the American people via Twitter every single day, and he talks to the press constantly during the week, constantly. Press briefings should be in the absence of the president, and the president is just not absent. And I would say to those former press secretaries, White House press secretaries, they know this to be true. This president has probably spoken directly to the press more than all of their bosses combined. So it was really unfortunate to me that, being a member of one of 30 people who are press secretaries, that they would come out when they know full well what a press secretary does behind the scenes, and they know full well why we are making the decisions that we are. But we're comfortable with it.
All right. It's been 308 days, March 11, 2019. That was the criticism from the side that's got, as you said, a perspective on it that they're not hearing directly from you and the other 29, but they get the president. Let's move on. The president is facing criticism after retweeting an image of Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi doctored to show them in Muslim garb, captioned, "The corrupted Dems trying their best to come to the Ayatollah's rescue." One Twitter reaction read this way, Stephanie: "Why the actual hell is the President of the United States using the way I and millions of other Americans dress and the religious beliefs that we hold as a slur? This absolutely must be condemned by congressional lawmakers on both sides of the aisle." Why would the President take even the time to retweet something like this?
I think the president is making clear that the Democrats have been parroting Iranian talking points and almost taking the side of terrorists and those who were out to kill the Americans. I think the president was making the point that the Democrats seem to hate him so much that they're willing to be on the side of countries and leadership of countries who want to kill Americans.
You know, it's interesting. His tweet in Farsi over the weekend, the Washington Times reported, was the leading Persian tweet in all of Twitter's history. So followed by this retweet, you can understand why people are concerned.
Well, certainly, but the president has made so clear that he is with the Iranian people. And the Iranian people have been chanting, you know, that America they thought was the enemy and that they had been lied to. There was an American flag put on the ground that people are actually walking around. So that is because of this president's leadership. If anything, it's the Democrats who should be on the side of this president and rejoicing that a terrorist was killed and that these Iranian people have a real opportunity to do good things with their country.
Stephanie Grisham, thank you for being on the program in the new year.
Thank you.
Wish you the best.
Happy New Year.